Hi, it's Todd from Todd's Workshop and Todd Cutler here, and today I'm with Stuart Orme, the curator of the Cromwell Museum in Huntingdon, and I have got one of Oliver Cromwell's original swords in front of me, which I'm here to document because I'm going to be making a copy of it and bringing it back in with Stuart's blessing to compare the two.
Absolutely.
And it's going to be a difficult job. So, tell me about the sword, Stuart.
I hate to say it, Todd, but you've not picked the easiest one to choose here. As you can see, it's hugely elaborate.
Yeah.
So, this beautiful item is one of 3 swords we've got in the collection, which are on long-term loan to the Cromwell Museum from Cromwell's descendants. So they've got a pretty unimpeachable provenance to them.
So there's always the chance of fakery and hoodwinkery in the past.
Yeah.
But essentially, this is a dead cert once Oliver Cromwell sword.
Of the other swords we've got, one of them actually appears in one of the paintings, so that's absolutely cast iron. You can't really argue with that. This one we know certainly was in the family as far back as the 1700s. It's been passed down ever since with all the details and everything else out of it. We're kind of 99% certain. So it's as close as you can get with this sort of thing.
May I?
Of course you may.
This is the privilege, the real privilege of what I do. You just see the YouTube stuff. I get to handle it, and days like this.
Yeah.
Thank you, Stuart. It's light, isn't it?
It is. I mean, it's one of the mythologies which you must deal with all the time about, particularly things like Hollywood movies tend to depict swords as great sort of chunks of iron which are really unwieldy. This is beautifully balanced, and I have to say I've always sort of said this is actually my favourite sword in the collection. I've always had a running joke with myself that if the zombie apocalypse ever happens, this is my weapon of choice.
It's not, you know though, I'd want something a bit more cleavery.
Possibly to get through those zombie skulls, yeah.
Zombie apocalypse, falchion.
Yeah.
But I get where you're coming from. It is beautiful.
It's lovely and it's really well balanced.
Goodness, what a thing. And it is in exceptionally good condition. And it's always interesting with anything which has got a complex hilt is you pick up a reproduction or sort of a reenactment reproduction, which, because as a reenactor, actually you're familiar with as well.
Yeah.
And the hilts are usually massive and really gappy, and you pick up a real one, and they're really very close to the fist. And actually, here, the guard is actually touching my fist. There has been some deformation where it's been dropped or stamped on or something.
Possibly.
But not a lot.
No.
And it has already touched my fist. So come and have a look at this. So you can see here where there's a bit of deformation. I'm guessing that it was probably no more than 6 or 7 millimetres, a quarter of an inch, between my fist and that guard when it was originally done. But look at this. What an extraordinary piece. So, I've bitten off quite a lot reproducing this, especially as this is not my given period. But what a thing.
So the blade we think is German. You correctly identified that with some of the markings on the blade here. It's also been inscribed with his initials. You can see in the very short fuller there is on the blade here as well.
But interestingly, we've got the running wall for Passau on both sides, and the initials on both sides, and the maker's stamp on both sides, maker's mark, which is, I can't recall seeing that actually before.
It's quite unusual. I'm not aware of many other existing examples of it, but yes, it's obviously somebody was making quite a statement with this particular sword. Yeah. And then what's interesting as well is also on the blade there's a little bit of evidence a bit further down. If you look here, for example, there are a few little knocks on the blade. So there, for example, now whether or not that indicates use, that's an interesting question.
It's definitely blade-on-blade contact, and you can actually see that the angle that it's been struck at. You can see where the other blade has struck it. So that maybe it has, maybe it hasn't. I mean, it's way beyond the centre of percussion, so it's not where you would choose to strike. No, but nonetheless, it is a strike on a blade.
It is. And I mean, whether or not that's a later generation of the Cromwell family dancing up and down the stairs playing with great-granddad's sword or not.
I certainly did
that's entirely a possibility. So we can't be sure for that. And one of the things, obviously, as we say about it, is it's incredibly light, and it's just one of the mythologies we get, both from sort of from for the Hollywood movies and so forth, as compared to what is the reality of these swords.
It is. I mean, we'll weigh this in due course, but I mean, it's under £2. It's I don't know, a kilo-ish, maybe a little bit more. So
I think from memory, it's been a while since I've measured it, but it's about a kilo in weight. So
yeah, there we are, and it balances right about on the initial O. So it balances on Oliver.
Absolutely.
But what a thing.
And the basket hilt here, this is of course typical of the type of sword that we refer to as a mortuary sword. And it's got kind of some of the classic decoration that you can see on a mortuary sword, which are these sort of little heads of people on here. Now, the reason why we call it a mortuary sword is, yet again, a Victorianism. And the Victorians saw these little severed heads of people on these sorts of things and assumed that it must be the severed head of Charles I. And therefore, that's where the kind of mortuary name comes from. Actually, it's not. They're just kind of classical heads and sort of decoration. You know, this is at a period where classical decoration with the foliage and so forth that you can see on the hilt here.
They're looking back to past times, in essence.
Very much so.
Picking design elements.
Yeah.
And so obviously I'm assuming this style of sword didn't just spring into existence post his death. So the whole thing was
exactly
just made up from day one.
Absolutely. And the swords like this, I mean, there's hilted swords like this exist throughout the Civil War period, for example. They're very much a classic English cavalry sword of the mid-17th century. And this, we should point out, is definitely a cavalryman's sword. It's got the length of blade and the reach to it that it's designed to be able to reach down from horseback and to slash an opponent and cause serious damage. Again,
it's interesting though that it is very delicately made in the sense of, I'm looking at these guards here, the Knuckle Guard, and it is 1.5, 1.8 millimetres thick, 5 millimetres wide.
Yep.
Any kind of a sword strike on that is going to collapse it onto your hand. So that whole concept of a sword being indestructible is yet again shown to be just junk.
I mean, I think this one here is very much an officer's sword, and it's one that's sort of as much a status symbol as anything else out of it, as well as being obviously a functioning weapon. What is quite interesting, though, and is quite unusual compared to many mortuary swords of this period, is this thumb ring on this side, which we don't tend to see quite so many examples of. And actually, I find personally that it's sort of, when I've held it, it actually feels, it almost balances the sword a little bit better once you've kind of got your thumb inside it.
Well, yes, I mean, it makes the whole thing more nimble. I'm not a fencer in that sense, but I certainly used to. And I understand that the additional control that gives you. But the hilt work itself, so the main composition of this, it is obviously covered in silver, and you can actually see, in my terminology, I call that kofgari, that the surface has been disrupted, and then the silver has been pushed into that, effectively. And then burnished back. So the whole surface is done like that. And the underlay is what? Is that iron under here?
Yes, it appears to be an iron hilt underneath there, which, as I say, has been silvered.
Yeah. So that has not been cast, that has been formed and chiselled.
Presumably, yes. That's your area of expertise far more than mine.
That is one evil job, I can tell you. He said, peering over his glasses because he can barely see the detail. So, what a fascinating thing. What I would say is, as a piece of quality work, it is not phenomenal.
No.
There is better quality pieces.
It is, but I think that, that possibly meets the needs of the period we're talking about, where you're manufacturing stuff in a sort of a period of a civil war, where perhaps there isn't necessarily the sort of the time and craftsmanship available to be able to work on these sorts of things to the level of detail you might do in peacetime, for example. And, I suspect to some extent it possibly meets also Cromwell's more utilitarian character, as it were, sort of,
Well, I suppose later on he was effectively an emperor or a king. But
yes.
I'm guessing perhaps at the time that this was delivered, that was not the case.
No, I mean, at the time this was delivered, I suspect this is while he is a soldier, so he's a military commander.
Yeah.
This is a man who, at the age of 43, has started a military career whilst a backbench MP. So contrary to the film Cromwell, where he starts off as a hugely significant figure to start off with from day one, he's basically a scruffy oik from the provinces who finds himself a soldier, a junior cavalry officer with no military experience whatsoever. As was quite common for many of them actually during the Civil War. This was a nation that really had been at peace for some 70 years or so, and an era without a standing army. And amazingly, at the age he was, he actually proved to be good at it. He was quite a charismatic figure. He was good with people. He was good with horses. He bred horses, so he understood them, and therefore was a good cavalry commander. He was decisive. He could see what needed to be done, and it's almost like his second religious conversion. His first to his Puritan faith in the 1630s, and then in the 1640s he sees it as sort of God's providence, that he's basically, that's his sort of purpose on this earth, is to be a good soldier.
To fight for God.
Yeah,
sort of
absolutely.
Almost a warrior monk in a way then.
In a way, yes. I mean, he's a curiosity in the sense that he's almost, in certain respects, in terms of his devout faith, one could say that he's almost fundamentalist in terms of his beliefs, but he's also somebody who believes in freedom of worship for others. So he's something sort of a paradoxical character. Yeah, and that's many things about Cromwell. He's layered by mythology and layered by paradox.
Coming back to the hilt work on this, it does become interesting that I've noticed it before very often in museum swords, that you look at it, and you look at it from a metre away, and you're blown away by how extraordinary the piece is.
Yeah.
And then you pick it up and you squint at it like I'm doing, peering over my specs. And you go, oh, actually. And there's one I'm thinking of particularly in the Wallace collection that I love. And you look at it, it's just stunning, stunning, stunning piece. And then you pick it up and you study it and you think, actually, that work is rough as heck. It really is. But the thing is, it looks good, great there. You know, he's on a horse, he's moving around, he's commanding his troops, he's waving his sword in the air. Yeah. And it looks fantastic.
To some extent, I mean, a lot of this stuff is for show from a distance, because obviously, you know, nobody's going to come that close to him, as it were, to be able to examine these sorts of things. And you can see this, for instance, with things like clothing of the 17th and 18th century, for example, where, you know, you look at some of the beautiful detail on surviving pieces that's in many museums, but actually, once you get on the inside and look behind the scenes out of it, it looks like it's been sewn by somebody wearing boxing gloves, because it doesn't matter. It's on the inside and tucked away. Nobody's going to see.
I always bang on about that with weapons. You have the show side and you have the not show side. Yeah. And the not show side can be rough as heck sometimes. Yeah. And because it's just not important.
Yeah, and I think that's very much the case with some of these items as well. Yeah. So.
But it has survived the years phenomenally well. This is going to take some doing.
I don't envy you this, but well, I'll be really interested to see the process, Boo, because if it can also reveal something more about how this was actually originally made and the sort of, you know, the workmanship behind it, then that would also be really interesting from our point of view.
Well, actually, depressingly, I'm not going to be able to do that because. And this is really important. This is going to bring us now onto the next stage of what we're doing, which is how I am going to set out reproducing this, because the world has moved on.
Yeah, technology is very different.
Technology is very different, and the labour required to hand cut this and hand chisel that, I mean, I could see that being a few weeks' work making that guard. Yeah. Not silvering it, just making the guard. And I would not make it as well as it's done here. And that's not what I want to do. I want to make a really good replica. And the thing is, as well, historically, blade maker from Germany in this case, but you have a blade maker who does one bit. A jeweller would have done that. Another jeweller, probably a different one, would have done all the silver inlay in it. I don't know about the pommel. That was probably roughed out by a smith, and then again back to a jeweller for the carving, and then the silver overlay. So you have many, many people involved in producing this. Yeah. And there's just little old me. So I'm going to do it a different way that doesn't involve just little old me. How am I going to reproduce this? Because it really is a piece of work. Well, as I identified with Stuart, it's not going to be me on my own. I do need help with this. Yeah. So I'm going to measure it now, just taking all the principal measurements, tracing it, and that's going to give me all the information for the blade work. That's fine, that's relatively straightforward. It's actually, thankfully, a relatively straightforward blade. The hilt work, that's a killer. Now, I have a sculptor friend, because I am not able to sculpt like this. I have a sculptor friend who can do this. But actually, he works on films quite a lot, and he is away and out the country. So the proposition that I am going for now is that I'm going to photograph all of this, put it using a process called Photogrammetry, which will make a 3D visual model of this hilt. And then what I'll do is 3D print that, but I'll still lose an awful lot of the detail. It won't be touched by man, you know, or mankind.
Well, that's the thing, isn't
Humankind.
it? You can see the sort of level of detail, and it's sort of really somebody's heart and soul that's gone into this, and it's got that kind of level of humanity in a way, if that sounds about right, for the sort of detail on it, which you want to kind of reflect, I suppose.
Very much, and my fear is that if I just 3D printed this, even if I could capture it, which I think I couldn't, I would lose that. And so I'm going to take a 3D print of the form, if you like, and then I'm going to send that to my friend Matt, and Matt is going to sculpt the detail onto that form. So in that way we get the form absolutely perfect, and we get the humanity of the sculpting that Matt's going to give it, because he is a genius when it comes to this.
It's a nice compromise between sort of old and new in a way, really, isn't it, then, and getting the best of both worlds in terms of producing a replica.
I think very much so, because I don't think I could actually do this justice by doing it in the way that the original guy did it, because, you know, the steel chiseler who did this, that's his job, that's all he's done for the last 20, 30, 40 years. That's not all that I've done, and I'm just not going to be good enough. And so I 3D print it, Matt over-sculpts it with the detail, and we will end up with something beautiful, which is what this sword deserves.
Excellent. Look forward to seeing that.
Yeah, so do I, actually. It won't be next week.
No, I'm guessing not.
So, first thing is, we will trace this. I'll put a few notations on it, and we'll take it from there.
Cool, okay.
So we have a piece of paper here, which I then actually take away. I've got a little rack with all of my tubes with notes on it. And we're going to trace the blade on here, and then I'll turn it around and we'll carry on with all the major measurements.
That's fine.
If you could give me a hand.
Yep.
That would be great.
Right, let me know what you'd like to do.
So, if you just pop the tip of the blade there where it says 0.
Yep.
And I'm just going to run that off the edge of the table. There we go.
Okay, yep, we're all dead on there.
Brilliant. He's a pointy little fellow, this one, isn't he?
Oh, yeah.
But isn't it interesting how international trade was such a thing? Because, okay, this is, 1645 or 1650, whenever this sword was made. But they've been importing blades for hundreds of years in that context, but the Vikings used to do the same,
Absolutely, and you've got a huge amount of munitions and weapons coming into England in the 17th century, particularly during the Civil War period anyway, at a time when there wasn't necessarily a huge amount of manufactories in England, but of course they were benefiting from the huge amounts of material that had been generated on the continent during the 30 Years' War.
Oh, were they buying in used cannons and stuff like that?
Well, you've got arms manufactories from fighting in 30 years of conflict across much of the continent, and so yes, they were sort of securing weapons and equipment for both sides, particularly for the Royalist cause, but Parliament as well. And not only that, but also you find there are also foreign troops who are coming in to fight. So there's, for instance, things like the Queen's Regiment, who are composed entirely almost of French troops fighting on the Royalist cause. There is, for instance, a Captain Sobieski who's in the Parliament's forces, who's a Polish cavalry officer. So, the idea that sort of the English Civil War is English is actually a hugely Anglo-centric view. Actually, it's a conflict that sort of tears apart the whole of Britain and Ireland, affects all four parts of the country, the Wars of Three Kingdoms, as they tend to be referred to by historians today. And of course, also there's actually a substantial amount of continental involvement as well.
But that would just be sort of mercenaries coming over, just making a bit of money, as opposed to having a vested interest?
In some cases, some of them came over for political reasons, but yes, some of them also were sort of professional soldiers who were taking it as an opportunity opportunity to sort of make their living whilst they were over here, and particularly given the fact that certainly in England there wasn't a huge amount of military experience, although some men had been abroad and actually fought us in the 30 Years' War themselves. They weren't on huge numbers, so bringing in some military expertise from the continent was seen as being, beneficial by both armies at that time.
What do I know? Thank you for that.
It's all right. What's next?
Well, I'm just going to pop that down now. So we've got a position for the blade, so I've got an accurate trace of the blade.
Yeah.
And then, really, I'm going to measure this anyway, and we're going to photograph it and get our 3D models. But now, really, what I'm going to do is make reference measurements so that when I have my model,
right,
I can refer to this.
Okay.
So, the overall length of the piece, the length of the grip,
yeah,
how far out that guard comes, how far out the counter guard comes, and so on. Just fundamentally, just so I can check.
Yeah.
Simple as that. So I'm just going to mark off. Right. So, the blade's the easy bit, so I'm not going to fret too much about that at the moment. So we have a pommel.
So you're getting exact measurements with the calipers here?
Yeah, just...
It's sort of oval in shape, so it's not exactly
not quite
round.
Circular, yeah.
Yeah, so it's sort of, you'll find, I think it's... in terms of the way we're looking at it at the moment, it's longer in terms of its width and its depth. Very slightly.
Well, now, so we have a tang button as well here. So really these are just notes for when I come back and actually make this thing. So the tang button is round, but sort of, it's interesting, these are all the little details you need to look for. So it's sort of rounded on the underneath and then flat on that, so it has an equator to it.
Of course, what we don't know actually about this sword is when it actually dates from. So we sort of assume that it's probably slightly later in Cromwell's career. So it doesn't seem elaborate enough for the period when he became Lord Protector in the 1650s. It kind of sort of might be when he becomes a more senior officer in sort of the mid to late 1640s. But we've no idea for certain when it would have been. The other sword, Mortuary Sword, very similar to this one we've got, is depicted in a painting which we can pretty much date to 1649, which is probably painted in the spring of that year, sort of between the execution of Charles I before Cromwell sailed for his infamous campaign in Ireland, which of course is one of the parts of his story which makes him so notorious in Ireland even today. We recognise and try and tell the fact that he's one of the most controversial figures in British and Irish history, and we try and tell his story warts and all, as it were, which is one of those phrases he very kindly invented for us as an advertising slogan.
It is difficult, isn't it? Because any mention of Cromwell is going to be controversial. I mean, the guy got up to a lot of bad things, good things. But it must also be remembered that he was a man working within his time, and it's difficult for me to pass judgment in the sense of clearly he did some disgusting things or was involved in some disgusting things. But to him at the time, it was viewed perhaps a little extreme, but essentially the thing to do.
Absolutely, and it's one of the things that historians continue to discuss and debate even today. So things like the storming of Drogheda in Ireland, which under the rules of war understood in the 17th century may well have been considered legitimate, but today which many people would consider with justification to be a war crime. Sort of, obviously there are those today who are adherents of Charles I who would still consider it wrong to be a regicide and to, effectively be involved with the trial and execution of an anointed monarch. But, there are others, on the other hand, who feel that, he's a heroic figure, either in terms of his role in, the establishment of parliamentary supremacy and also his policies on religious toleration. So, for instance, the Jewish community in England sort of feels that they have a great deal to owe to him because he was the first person to allow
is that right?
Yeah, the reintroduction of the Jewish community who'd been expelled in 1290. So in the 1650s.
That's interesting.
So under Cromwell's religious policies in the 1650s, they're reintroduced, and also you get the sort of beginnings of the nonconformist movement, so the Baptists and the Quakers also owe their origins to this particular period.
But he was less sympathetic to them, was he not?
He brought in a sort of policy which, sort of in terms of almost, I suppose, kind of relaxing the rules in terms of church attendance, which allowed these other non-conformist sects to develop. So again, they to some extent owe their origins to him. So it's an interesting period in terms of this turmoil of religious viewpoints and political ideas. The Levellers, who Cromwell sort of was involved in suppressing, who were advocating ideas of democracy, which actually, seem almost modern in many respects.
But they were not the first, though, were they? There were other sects, if you like, before the Levellers, predating them massively. Sorry, I'm just having a general chit-chat about history.
No, please do. The Levellers are quite radical in fact. So you get the famous Putney debates in November 1647, which Cromwell is chairing and is sort of trying to keep a balanced viewpoint of, where you have the grandees of the army on the one hand and representatives of some of the ordinary soldiers on the other. And they're starting to advocate what are actually quite radical concepts of the 17th century. So the principle of getting rid of being imprisonment for debt and the idea of one man, one vote for the first time. So this is one of the reasons why this period, I think, is so emotive for people today, actually, in some respects. It's interesting, we get people who come into the museum who will tell us even today that they're a Roundhead or a Cavalier. I don't know many periods of history where people still feel that they have to identify so strongly with one side or the other. And I think that's because it raises questions about religion and freedom and the nature of monarchy and democracy and freedom of the press, which we're still actually wrestling with in 2021. So it's, in one sense, it feels both something a very long time ago, but also very fresh as well.
Yeah, he's quite a man. Quite a legacy to leave behind.
Quite a legacy to leave behind. And
like him or hate him.
Love him or loathe him, you can't ignore it.
He got up to stuff.
Absolutely, yeah. So, he's had that. Our job is, as I say, to try and tell that story because he is a hugely significant figure, regardless of whether you love him or loathe him. As I say, we try and tell his story, warts and all.
As you can see, I've just made notations here of all of the little areas that are going to confuse me. And things like the grip, for instance, here, which is actually, it's a hexagonal grip, but it transitions from round at the pommel, going into a fairly pronounced hexagon, and then coming down into an oval, so it's a blend the whole way through. And then covered in the most evil wire work I've ever seen.
It's interesting, isn't it? You wonder why the maker sort of went for that particular shaping. It seems quite unusual in a way, really.
It's all fanciness, isn't it? It's a bit like we described before, is that when you put these layers of detail on, you're saying money. That's what you're doing. You're saying money. Again, possibly that's why the blade is marked on both sides. You want people to know that you've got your German blade, and even if they look at the wrong side of it, they still know you've got a German blade.
Yeah.
Anyway, would you be able to help me a little bit, just making notations as I
certainly, yeah.
So what I'm going to do now is we've got the blade tip here, so I'm just going to start. If you would be able to make, I'll do the measurements, call them out, and if you could just write down next to the 85 centimetre mark the 80 and so on.
Yeah, that's fine.
And that would be great. So at the hilt, it's only 4.3mm thick, which is 3/16 of an inch, I think, give or take. So it's a thin blade. 4.3. So it's gone thicker. Not unusual, actually, that sort of thing.
It's interesting that that's very slight variation, isn't there?
Well, it's handmade, of course.
Yeah.
24.2. But yes, it's not unusual that blades actually don't taper consistently. In fact, 4.5. So it's got thicker again. .9. Lovely. Thank you very much.
It's really interesting that you sort of, you see it as being a very even blade, but just actually when you measure it down to that level, the level of fluctuation really does show, as you say, it's a sort of handmade item, isn't it? So, that you've got that level of difference inside it that you wouldn't get from a precision machine-made item necessarily today.
But it's interesting, that brings me straight back to one of the modern conundrums, is I can't make a blade like that, because if I send that to a customer, he'll tell me that it's rubbish. It's true.
Yeah.
So it's one of those things that you have to decide, really, how you're going to portray this piece. Is it a slavish, exact, accurate copy of it in every dimension? Or are you intending the spirit of it? And it's a difficult path to tread.
Yeah, there's an interesting art of compromise with that one. So presumably that depends as much as anything else on the client's requirements.
To an extent, but actually a handmade object can be quite difficult, because if I do this, and let's just say I make that and it's 1 millimetre too long, am I going to throw it out for being 1 millimetre too long? Well, maybe, but the point is that then interacts with something else. And then that thing has to be a different shape, because the original thing is a different shape. And then that interacts with something else. And then suddenly, by the time you get down to the end of your piece, you might have a 5 millimetre or an 8 millimetre difference because of these choices that you've had to make, because the first thing that you did wasn't quite right.
Is it sometimes a matter of almost like an artistic judgment, do you think, and a sort of, it looks right?
Very much. I very much work on the basis if it looks right, it is right.
Yeah.
But the other thing as well is that I think there's always a danger of making something very sterile if you copy it exactly, because the guy who made this wasn't sitting there continually with his calipers all the time. What he was doing is he was making a sword.
Yeah.
And what I want to do is make a sword, and I think that I can give the sword life by just making a sword like he did, but that means that there will always be inevitably differences.
Yeah.
But the thing that remains the same is that I am making it like he was making it, which is just making a sword.
Yeah.
Because it becomes very different if I'm not just making a sword, I'm precisely trying to copy something and I'm measuring and I'm checking and I'm doing this. And then I might get the object correct, but the spirit has gone.
In that sense, you're sort of, it's almost kind of like trying to channel the spirit of the original maker in a way, really. It's sort of a process.
No, I think so, yeah. I mean, I think that's part of the process, because you can make an exact copy, but it just won't have life. Yeah. And if it hasn't got life, it's not right.
Yeah.
So, there we are. So we have a full dimension set.
Excellent.
It's a full data set for the blade here, all the cross sections. And then really just notations about the hilt, because obviously there's an awful lot of complexity in the hilt and in the wire work and so on. And so it's just a series of little notes for myself that when I come back to it, I'll remember what I'm looking at, really, when I look at it alongside the photographs. Because photographs won't tell the whole story. Well, the first part has been done, so I've noted all the dimensions, all my little sketches, all my little thoughts and insights into it on a piece of paper.
Right.
Very old school.
Yep.
And now I'm going modern, and it's a process called photogrammetry. So what happens is I just take, hundreds of photos, very steadily, just moving around in an arc, changing the sword position, taking more photos, and then goes into a piece of software, stitches them all together and creates basically a 3D view of this hilt work here.
This is a similar process to kind of laser scanning to get a kind of 3D model of it, but using photographs instead, effectively.
Yes, yeah, it's a very similar kind of technique. And I've put it on a baseboard here with some strong markings on it that the software uses to help register where everything is. That will then give us our 3D model. That I can print, and then Matt can do the sculpting onto it and make something beautiful. So here we are.
Excellent.
So,
Make it sound simple.
somebody else's problem. Right. So we're all the way around, Stuart.
Yeah, well, that's an awful lot of photographs that he's got into there.
Well, you can't have too many.
No, absolutely. Well, particularly with something this level of detail, I should imagine as well.
Yeah, I mean, there is some frighteningly fine detail on it.
And you're saying that sort of the computer program can effectively put all of these together and it does most of that itself?
It does, yeah, that's my understanding. I mean, I am as IT illiterate as it is possible to be, but I have friends. And yeah, my understanding is you feed the photos in and it basically puts it together for you. You've always got to go in and just correct the odd little bit, which is not quite right. But essentially, yes, it does most of the work.
That's brilliant.
So we just need to come in from the front now. So I think if we swap the sword around.
Okay, that's fine. Right, try not to impale yourself on the end because it is actually still sharp.
It is, yes, it is. Now, could you just move that Perspex mount away from the guard? Yeah, so
take it down
I think that will be fine. So again, it's exactly the same process that I'll just photograph in.
Yes, particularly the level and height it's at. That could be, shall we say, slightly painful and embarrassing. It's interesting, actually. I mean, as we were saying, so even you know, as somebody who's very used to this object, it's interesting looking at it for this level of time, and particularly in this lighting as well. You kind of notice, you know, even more detail on it than I'm usually used to.
Yes. Yeah. Could you turn again, please, Stuart?
Yep.
Yeah, that's the thing. I mean, it's well, you tell me. You're the curator, but I imagine that you spend your day doing your job, not looking at pieces all the time.
No, and absolutely. In a small museum like this, where you know you're kind of, my job involves being everything from sort of fundraiser to doing the cleaning to volunteer manager to dealing with retail bits and pieces and all sorts of stuff. Yes, you know, it's actually nice to be able to spend this level of time actually with a single object and actually sort of, you know, really take the time to appreciate it in a way, really.
No, I can imagine that. Well, I think, Stuart, that is about that.
Yeah, I reckon you must have taken somewhere in the region of about 100 photos there in total.
I think quite a lot more. But the thing is, the scary thing for me now is I've not used this process before, so I have to have faith that something I haven't done before is good enough to do the job that somebody else is going to do. Anyway,
we'll keep our fingers crossed, and yeah, I'm sure it'll be fine.
Well, Stuart, I've taken every photo I need to take, and probably doubled that.
I was going to say at least you know, a huge amount of photos there, so hopefully it'll kind of knit together into a good product at the end of it.
Well, I hope so, because I mean it is an unknown process for me, so it'll be really interesting actually to see the melding of very modern technology with very old school technology like I run. But really, thank you so much, because I know as a charitable organisation, you know, this is kind of a big deal for you as well, because I'll be donating for every one of these I make. But really, it's a brilliant museum.
Thank you.
It really is. And it's, I think, I'm right in saying it's the largest collection of Cromwell artefacts in the world, really.
Yeah.
I was going to say memorabilia.
No. I mean, yeah, it's the best collection in the world of artefacts relating to Cromwell. It's the largest on public display. And yeah, our job is to tell the story of this hugely significant, fascinating, remarkable, but also very controversial figure, and bring them to life for people.
So, well, and I think you do it very well.
Thank you.
Absolute privilege handling this sword. So thank you for letting me. Thank you for letting me measure it, photograph it, and ultimately reproduce it. So,
no, we're very much looking forward to seeing the finished article.
About a year, maybe.
Well, you know, do bring it back, and we'll compare it to the original and see what sort of the differences between the two of them are, and hope, you know, how close it gets.
No, I'd love to do that. It's always an absolute pleasure to lay things side by side and have a look. So,
Brilliant.
Stuart, Cromwell Museum, thank you very much.
You're very welcome, Todd. Thank you very much.
Thank you.